Today on Real Talk, we're talking about affordability and how recent market conditions affect not only people looking to buy a home, but also how tough it is to rent a home in today's market. Today, we have the wonderful Lisa Sandhar. Lisa, thanks for coming on.
Thanks for having me, Peter.
Lisa, you've been with the team for 6 years just now. I wanted to talk today a little bit about affordability in the market, both in resale and in the rental market, which is something that we don't usually talk about.
Yeah.
Even with the dip in prices these last few months, it doesn't necessarily mean that there's been any more affordability in the market, either on the resale side or the rental side. Now, you've been a landlord for a number of years. Is there an aspect of this that you'd like to talk about?
Yeah, so I think the funniest story I have about a landlord is my son's bus stop a couple of years ago. I had a house coming up, we were upgrading, and I was casually speaking to somebody, and they said, oh wait, I have a friend for that property. You don't even need to put it on Kijiji, you don't need to do any advertising.
Wow.
And literally overnight, they signed the lease and it was done.
And how long ago would that have been?
That was 4 years ago.
That was 4 years ago.
Yeah, and they're still there. Yeah.
And I think it's just gotten tighter and tighter and tighter. Right?
It has, yeah, it has.
So the average rental price in Hamilton, I think, is somewhere around $1,800. For a 3-bedroom, I know it's something closer to $2,500, which is basically the cost of buying a $550,000 house. And that price just keeps on going up. You know, the ironic thing is, as the house prices go down and it gets tougher to buy in resale, the rental prices just keep on going up and up.
They do, yeah. But the thing to note, I think, too, is it's based on the Consumer Price Index. And since 2017, it's usually been based on inflation, right? So we had the freeze in 2021 for COVID. 2022, it was 1.2%, which was under inflation. And now 2023, it was announced before the July 13th hike from the Bank of Canada, the rental increase is 2.5% and inflation sitting at 5.3%. So we are still, you know, if you are a renter, you still are getting, I don't want to say a deal, but you are still getting a little bit under that inflation. So
a little bit of protection.
A little bit of protection.
Yeah.
You are getting a little bit of protection still. Not to say that it's, you know, cheap to rent. It's not, and it is a tough market because there's no supply. But just for my one rental, I'm thinking of it's going to go about $60 a month. Whereas if it was based on inflation, that'd be $130 a month.
Jeez,
so there is some, you know, there is some savings there. I mean, it is still obviously, you know, expensive to find a rental. And when you're finding a rental, you know, we had another colleague that took 5 or 6 times for them to get a lease.
Yeah, and they're getting in competition.
And they offered a year in advance.
Offers.
They offered a year in advance. Just take all the money up front, and they still didn't get it. So it's competitive.
And the numbers when we're talking about average rent, I really think that number is skewed because it's really tough to take into account when a tenant turns over and you've got all these units under rent control, like you mentioned, that can only increase by inflation or the Consumer Price Index. And you've also got units that aren't under rent control, like anything that hasn't been occupied prior to November 2018, there's no rent control on it. So the landlord can increase to market rents or whatever they want every 12-month period.
Yeah, and I had a property that was just on the market and he listed it for sale and the documents were up. We've had 20 showings, we had an offer, and the tenants went to him and said, can we please stay? We're willing to pay you market rent.
Right.
And they were there for 7 years. And of course, he could never have done that. You can't do that. You can't just arbitrarily raise rent for people who have been there.
Right.
So they offered that, and he went to the landlord tenant board and they signed all the documents and he took it off the market. So that just happened 2 months ago.
Oh, geez, that's crazy.
So, I mean, tenants are wanting to stay in their properties.
And it's one thing, like affordability is one thing, but there's also just the eligibility aspect of rentals, which is really, really tough when somebody's looking for a rental. They're asking you for all kinds of documents.
Guarantors, you know, a lot of times.
Guarantors, perfect credit check. I mean, if you're in the rental game, you know, we don't deal with it too much. The defense that I have for landlords, and I'm sure this is obvious, but there are definitely unscrupulous tenants. We actually, in our own office, we had a lady trying to rent an apartment unbeknownst to us, she was trying to do it on behalf of her boyfriend, who's actually in jail, which was crazy.
It takes all kinds.
Luckily, we sussed it out and figured out what was going on.
Yeah.
But that's a very crazy story, but it's an illustration of
and
why
we've
things
had
are so
tenants
tight.
at Mac too. We have rentals at Mac, and a lot of times it's mom and dad paying the bills, and they'll see an Electra bill and they just won't pay it.
Right.
And then you're stuck with thousands of dollars at the end of the year, or there's going to be a 12-month rental term and they leave after 8 and they don't pay. So I mean, I'm not saying, you know, all landlords are amazing and all tenants, obviously but it is challenging on both fronts. If you're stuck with a bad tenant, it is hard to get them out.
Exactly.
Right?
So you have all of this going on with the rental market, with the prices going up year after year. It just seems to not be stoppable, or if there hasn't been a pause to the increase in rental rates in recent years. And then that puts pressure on all of the resale prices. Like those investment properties become much more flavorful to investors when the rents are starting to outpace what the cost to own a house is.
Exactly.
And then if it keeps going this way, it might take us out of this hole of this slump in pricing, but tough to say. That's just one of the many factors at play in today's market.
Yeah, absolutely.
Well, awesome. Lots to talk about rentals, not too much time. But thank you very much for coming on, Lisa.
Thanks for having me.